I want to thank you all for joining today's Competency-Based Education CompetencyWorks webinar. My name is Susan Patrick, and I'm the President and CEO for INACOL. Today's webinar is focused on a recently released paper, The Logic Model Framework to Guide Research and Design of High-Quality K-12 Competency-Based Education Systems. Please use the chat room. It's in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. We found this is a vital part of engaging in the conversation. Please feel free to introduce yourself now, say where you're from, and your interest in competency-based education. Please also feel free to ask questions in the chat box and share your own insights responding to others' questions. All are welcome to engage. I'll be facilitating today's conversations with our authors of the paper. There's several points where we'll pause and I'll point to the questions that you leave in the chat box. So with this, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. The lead author of the paper, Katherine Casey, is the founder and principal of Katherine Casey Consulting, an independent organization focused on innovation, personalized and competency-based school design, and research and development. Katherine was a founding director of the Imaginarium Innovation Lab in Denver Public Schools, supporting a portfolio of almost 30 schools across Denver and spearheading the lab's research and development activity. Katherine was a founding design team member at the Denver School of Innovation and Sustainable Design, Denver's first competency-based high school. Prior to her time in Denver, Katherine worked in leadership development, philanthropy, public affairs, and higher education. She received her bachelor's from Stanford University and her doctorate in education leadership from Harvard. Now, please let me introduce Chris Sturgis. Chris is highly regarded and recognized for her leadership across competency-based education and co-founder of CompetencyWorks. Chris Sturgis is principal of MedisNet, a consulting firm based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, specializing in education, youth issues, and community engagement. Chris's approach begins with drawing on local knowledge, METIS, early in the design process. She is a prolific writer and facilitator on competency-based education based on knowledge gained through visits to schools and interviews with leaders in the field. Prior to CompetencyWorks, Chris worked in philanthropy for over a decade at the Mott Foundation, the Mid-Europe Network, and as consultant to national and regional foundations. Chris earned a master's in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Well, now I will turn it over to lead author Katherine Casey to begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you everyone for joining today. We're so excited to share what we have developed with those of you in the field. I want to share a little bit about our learning goals for today. We've organized today's webinar around 4 big questions. First, why is it that we need a logic model? How do we hope that a logic model can support the development and growth of competency-based education and contribute to work in the field? Second, what are the distinguishing features of competency-based education relative to traditional education? Third, what are the levers that can be used to inform how we design and implement competency-based ed? And then fourth, what is our theory, or our logic model, to define competency-based ed at multiple interrelated levels of practice? We have blocked out several points in the conversation today for Q&A. So please put your questions in the chat room, and Susan will help facilitate those discussions when we get to the Q&A time. I want to briefly share with you the model that we'll be discussing today. We will go into much greater detail about each of the components throughout the hour that we have here. We want to give you a short orientation. So here you see the model that we'll be discussing, and you'll see around the perimeter of the model 3 sets of gray boxes, and these are what we call design levers. At the right, you will see student success outcomes, and so this is where we talk about how we use new definitions of student success to design competency-based education systems. At the left, you'll see what we call drivers. In this case, we think about drivers as bodies of knowledge, learning sciences, and equity that we use to inform design again. And so here we want to think about how we know, what we know about the brain and what we know about racial and social justice and how those inform competency-based ed. Up top, you'll see mediating factors. This is where we discuss how we use local conditions to drive very purposeful variation between different schools and districts and states. You will see the logic models, 4 sets of them in the center. We look at 4 interrelated levels of practice: student experience, professional practice, district and school systems, and culture. And then finally, you'll note the continuous improvement loop that surrounds the logic models to note that competency-based ed systems are continuously evolving based on student learning and progress. A quick note here about how it is that we developed this model. The model was developed in cooperation with a broad and diverse technical advisory group, or a TAG, which included researchers and practitioners from across the country. This TAG informed the development of the model itself, as well as the drafting of the paper that we have recently released. So I want to thank all members of the TAG, and if any of you are on this call, thank you so much for your time, your energy, and your expertise. I will now pass the conversation over to Chris to talk a bit about competency-based education and where this sits in the field.
Hi, everybody. So the question was, why do we need a logic model? Last year, just about this time, we had a national summit on competency-based education, the K-12 sector. And what came out of that conversation was a real demand for a logic model. And the reason is that a lot of districts and schools are turning to competency education for many reasons. And that's everything from coming to understand that the traditional system is a barrier, global competitiveness where districts and schools want to really lift the cap off of learning. Some people really want a more equitable system. Some people are looking for a system for deeper learning. Some people really want to have more personalized opportunities. Some are really focused on doing what's best for kids and fully aligning with the research on the learning sciences. And some are really systems-oriented people who want a responsive, adaptive system of continuous improvement. So we have all these different districts and schools coming to competency ed for different reasons, and we're seeing this tremendous expansion of competency-based education. Now this picture is of state policy. So in 2012, we had about a third of the states doing something. Perhaps it was waivers or innovation grants. A few districts, a few states in the northeast corner of the country were actually advancing competency-based credits or diplomas. But now we get to 2018, and almost every state has done something to at least make room for districts and states to move towards competency-based education. That doesn't mean that there's districts and schools advancing everywhere across the country, right? But there's room now for people to do it in a way that there never was before. So we're seeing more and more folks interested in competency-based ed. And here's the issue. We've got people coming from different reasons, and now there's more expansion, but with expansion comes quality challenges. And that's why we thought we really need a logic model. A logic model can really help us in so many different ways. So one of the things that's been challenging for us as a field is we don't have the data we would like confirming that this is making a difference for students and teachers, and confirming and helping us understand what a high-quality comprehensive model is. Part of that is that there hasn't been tremendous funding for it, and what funding has been available tends to either be shaped around a foundation strategy, or it's in smaller chunks of funding than what we really need, because competency-based education is a school-wide at a minimum, but preferably a district-wide strategy. And that's really important. It's not just a classroom strategy, so it requires the entire school to make that commitment. That's a much more challenging research project. We've also seen across the country as different people come to competency education for different reasons, misconceptions. And there's all different types. One of the ones that we are constantly challenged by is there's some people who believe it just is the same as online learning or adaptive software. Well, it's not. as we always say, call that what it is. It's the use of technology to support instruction. But because this is a school-wide, district-wide approach, which we'll talk about in more detail, people often think it's that they'll approach it as a minimalist. Well, if I just make this change in this one thing, then I'm competency-based. Well, that's not going to work either. And what we've seen is some problematic implementation when people really start with grading as their first step in the changes, and that leads to all kinds of problems if they don't have the rest of the structure in place. And we're also interested in starting to note that when people have different entry points to introducing competency-based education, they may be actually also creating different types of designs and models. And that's something we're paying attention to. Again, that complicates the quality challenge, because now we're thinking, well, how do we think about quality if there's actually different models? So we're paying attention to that. So that's the logic models to help us with all of those things. Now, what I'm going to turn to right now, just to give everybody just level set you around what competency-based education is, we're going to cover the 10 distinguishing features of competency-based ed. And if you go to the paper, it starts on page 4. This list of 10 was developed by a technical advisory group on the working definition to deepen our understanding of competency-based education. And it's organized into 3 different clusters. So one is purpose and culture. Second one is around pedagogy, and the third is around structure. And what we've discovered is that competency-based education requires changes in all 3. So as we go to purpose and culture, there are 3 areas that are different in competency-based schools than in traditional ones in general. One is that the student success outcomes are broader. It's not just about academics. It's really about preparing students with the academic knowledge, the transferable skills or the higher order skills that they need to actually apply that academic knowledge, and lifelong learning. And we're going to come to that again in the logic model. The districts and schools make a commitment to be responsible for all students mastering learning expectations. So what that really means is it's not just, oh, we're going to make everybody, have everybody college and career ready. The question becomes, what are we going to do if a student isn't learning? It's starting to organize around the assumption that sometimes students are going to need extra help. And it also is a commitment to actually repair gaps. So when students enter a classroom and there's gaps in their previous knowledge, we don't let just that be passed along again. We actually take the time to make sure those students get the help they need. And the third, districts and schools nurture an empowering, inclusive culture of learning. And if you think about the traditional school, there's a top-down, more hierarchical approach to how decisions are made. And there's a heavy emphasis on achievement, on compliance and order. But in a competency-based school, the minute you start to think about student agency, you better be ready to have the school and the teachers be empowered to respond to students. Students are going to be active partners, and that changes the nature. The other piece is inclusivity. Students need to feel safe to learn. This is from the learning sciences. And so it's very important that a culture of the school is designed to make sure that every student is feeling safe. Now, let's look at the pedagogy, or your instruction and assessment. So this is really basic. Students receive timely and differentiated instruction and support. What we see is that there's some kind of flex hour every day so that students don't have to wait to get help. But it's also about meeting students where they are. And that doesn't mean we go back to tracking. What it means is we say, where are they in their grade level? What are their learning targets? And do they have all the prerequisite knowledge they need in order to learn? If they don't, what are we going to do to repair those gaps? So it's a different orientation than we've had before. The second, research-informed, which means from the learning sciences, pedagogical principles emphasize meeting students where they are and building intrinsic motivation. Everything we're doing, we should be drawing from the learning sciences in terms of cognitive development, but also about psychology, the emotional aspects of learning. And third, the assessments are really embedded in that personalized learning cycle. And that means that the students understand that assessment isn't being judged, but assessment is where they're going to get effective feedback about what they need to do differently. So what you'll really see in the competency-based schools, you won't see students just get a B and then they go on to the next assignment. If they got a B, then the question is, what did they not actually do well enough to be proficient? And they're going to revise, or they're going to keep practicing, or they're going to keep studying until they actually become successful. And then finally, we have 4 elements of structural changes. So the first one, mechanisms are in place to ensure consistency and expectations of what it means to master knowledge and skills. And this is a missing component to the American education system. This is the process of moderating expectations of what proficiency is, and it's done by looking at student work. And it needs to be done within a school, but it needs to be done across schools, and it needs to be done across districts, so that when we say a student is writing at 4th grade level or 4th performance level, it's pretty much the same expectation in school A as in school B across the state, right? And then it's also about calibrating the grading so that students would be getting the same type of feedback. This is all about basically building in quality controls into our system. It's very, very important in terms of equity. Schools and districts value transparency with clear and explicit expectations of what is to be learned, the level of performance for mastery, and how students are progressing. Transparency is important across the board, but it empowers the students. The strategies for communicating progress support the learning process and student success. That is about grading, but it's about grading that communicates progress and allows students to know what they need to do next. And then finally, learners advance based on attainment of mastery. And that really becomes a culminating feature of all the rest of the other features of competence-based education. So I'm going to turn this back to Katherine.
Thank you, Chris. When I shared the introduction and orientation to the logic model a few moments ago, I mentioned the levers that you saw in gray boxes in the framework. And I want to take a moment to define what exactly these are. So we define a lever as something that is used to shape and inform how we design and implement competency-based ed at all levels of practice. And we chose the term lever as opposed to something like design principle or characteristics because levers are essentially important to ensuring that we design for success for all. We think of them as sort of leverage points, right, or leverage strategies to achieving equity. So again, I want to quickly cover what these are and how we use them. I'll start again at the right with student outcomes. So as Chris mentioned earlier, we utilize expanded definitions of what it means to be successful for students in competency-based ed. And we use these really in 2 ways. One is to backwards engineer, if you will, all elements of competency-based systems. So if we want students to develop more than academic skills, the question has to then be, what else must they experience in their time in school in order to develop those different sets of competencies? And student success levers are used to represent the end result of successful systems as well as success at multiple milestones in a student's learning trajectory. And so we continuously seek to evaluate how students are being prepared for the real world with this broader set of knowledge and skills. Again, moving to the left, we have the drivers, which we call learning sciences and equity. So these are, again, evidence-based bodies of knowledge that are used to consistently design all levels of practice and really reduce variation in quality. And specifically, we know that we have to start grounding instructional design at all levels in what we actually know about how people learn. And secondly, we have to design for equity. We can't just hope that our approaches and strategies will result in success for all at some point down the line. We have to use what we know about race and gender, religion, orientation, and other dimensions of identity in the present day and historically to design systems that are organized for equity. And then thirdly, mediating factors. So we know that context matters, right? No 2 schools, no 2 systems will look exactly alike, and the purpose of having a logic model is not to create uniformity across the field. CBE systems have to be responsive to their context because they have to be responsive to students. That's one of the hallmarks of being competency-based. And in addition, we know that the best competency-based education systems are designed in partnership with families, with higher ed, with industry, and other stakeholder groups so that they firmly orient and root kids' K-12 educational experiences in their lives and in their futures. On this call today, for the sake of time, we're going to talk in a little more detail about 3 of these 4, so outcomes, equity, and learning sciences. I'll move forward with the outcomes lever and then pass it back to Chris. So if you look at this next slide, we know that traditional models tend to emphasize lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy. They expect students to prove basic recall and comprehension of content knowledge in alignment with grade level standards. And as Chris mentioned earlier, competency-based systems take a much more comprehensive view of student outcomes. And they do this in light of research about what students will actually need to know and be able to do to be successful in the future workforce and in our democracy. And they also take a broader view of outcomes as a value statement, right? Competency-based systems value supporting the whole child. They value promoting social emotional wellness, and they value empowering and increasing student agency. So specifically, competency-based systems will emphasize knowledge, and they will look to balance broad content knowledge with enduring understandings of really key concepts and skills. And that balance is one of the hallmarks and distinguishers, I would say, between competency-based and traditional systems. They will also look to emphasize transferable skills, right? The ability to apply and transfer knowledge to meaningful problems and meaningful contexts. And then thirdly, they'll emphasize lifelong learning, those skills, dispositions, and habits that contribute to students being able to continuously learn throughout the course of their academic experiences and the rest of their lives. Chris, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Katherine. Okay, so I'm going to first touch on, well, I'm going to talk about both of the drivers, actually, the learning sciences and equity. So I'm not going to talk about each one of these because you can actually find this on the paper on page 20. But I am going to say a little bit, we drew from multiple fields of research, and it was very interesting because we even had one researcher at one point go, oh my gosh, we can't say this because we're drawing from different areas of research, but the cognitive groups about how information is processed in the brain versus the research around the psychology and the emotional aspects of learning really rarely are integrated, and it means that the educators are left to try to make sense of it. And so we did that in this process as we drew from both. And we're very happy to have feedback if we didn't get it right. So let's just talk about a couple of these. Learning is an activity that is carried out by the learner. This is, when we think of the traditional classroom, a student just sitting there waiting to receive instruction, they're passive, they're compliant. They're actually not learning. What we need to be able to see is the students in the classroom doing the learning. And that's one of the key pieces of this, is that kids have to be doing something, and that's also where teachers can get a lot of the formative feedback through a lot of the formative assessment. A second one I'd really like to highlight is the fourth one. Intrinsic motivation leads to better long-term outcomes than extrinsic motivation. Again, the traditional system relies heavily on points, extrinsic motivation, hoping that students want to compete for a higher grade, compete for a higher GPA in high school. But what we have found in the research is that intrinsic motivation is actually what we want to develop. And that's why voice and choice and culturally responsive education, where students are really creating meaning from what they're learning and making connections to their lives, is why it's so very important. You'll get more effort, and we'll also get better long-term outcomes. The effort is also dependent on motivation and self-regulation, and I have to say this one stumped me for a little bit, because motivation is something that changes all the time. But self-regulation, of course, is that ability when we're super tired out to all of a sudden say, oh my gosh, I'm not really paying attention, I need to refocus, or I'm going to learn to manage my feelings while I'm learning, or whatever that is. Those self-regulation are really going back to those building blocks of learning, of the lifelong learning skills. And so when we're looking to have kids put forth their best effort, then we're actually asking, thinking about their motivation, but also about making sure we're helping them learn to self-regulate. If we go to the, I'm going to highlight 3 on this page as well. The first one is the cognitive process. And I think pretty much everybody knows this, but it's so important to remind ourselves that we have this working memory. And in fact, if competency-based ed is new, your working memory is probably full right now, and you might want to stand up, do a little dance. You might want to, shake it off, because you actually have to. We can have cognitive overload, and what happens is we have to be able to transfer it into the long-term memory in some way. And so we have to remember, when kids are learning, they may just max out sometimes cognitively and need to take a break, need to move. So that's a very important one. Acquiring new knowledge and skills requires effective feedback. That's the third one. This also comes to be just absolutely so important, which is that teacher feedback has to be precise and based around the specific standards and skills the students are learning. This type of feedback of, oh, you did a good job, doesn't help the student learn the next, what they didn't understand, right? They have to actually have feedback that's going to be based on that learning task. And then learning is a social process. I think as a country, we've really undervalued this. Those relationships between the student and the teacher are absolutely critical, and with the students and among the other students, absolutely critical. So why aren't we designing schools to really enhance those relationships? So that's what we should be thinking about as we're thinking about school design, is are we optimizing that relationship between the student and teachers? So that's the type of ways we can use the learning sciences to move us forward. Now, if you turn to page 23 in the paper, we also try to put this all together. And in the very middle, in the purple, what we have are the learning mindsets and skills that we want learners to have and what we want teachers to be able to help cultivate in students. In the gray is the second ring, which is the learning environment that would most enhance that. And then on the outside is the blue, which is the cognitive process of learning, which is constantly going on, right? It's constantly going on for all of us all the time. Now I'm going to move to the equity strategies. At the summit, we selected the National Equity Project's definition of educational equity, which we put here. And there were several reasons we did this. When you look at the 3 bullets, these aspects are so important. One is really committing to high outcomes for everybody. The second was interrupting inequitable practices. So it's not just good enough to add on extra services for somebody. We actually have to end inequitable practices. And the third one is discovering what makes, is beautiful about a human being, right? But when this definition talks about social potential, it's not up for the school or the teachers to decide what that potential is. Our job is to help students discover their potential. And that's a very, very important difference that we have to hold when we look at this definition. Now, when we begin to think about equity as drivers, I really learned through this process. I'd always thought of equity as a moral stance. It was something that you had to do the right thing. You had to be an advocate for. But what I really learned is that equity strategies are actually, they really do drive our choices and our behaviors. And here were a few that developed in this process. One is that we always should be promoting accountability and transparency. We should ensure high outcomes. And that accountability isn't the top-down type of accountability, but it's mutual accountability. Again, this comes down to blowing the whistle. If the student isn't learning, stopping and going, what's going on here that the student isn't getting what they need? We need to figure this out. That's the core of a sense of accountability. It's really responsibility. Prioritizing belonging and inclusion creates these inclusive multicultural schools. Again, the belonging and inclusion are about feeling safe, about having relationships, and are linked to the learning sciences. And invest in adult culture and development is very, very important. We know that the only way we're going to build this competency-based system for kids to learn is for the adults to learn. And part of that is addressing our bias. We all know that we have bias. There's not anything to be ashamed of. what is really shameful is if we're not doing our best to try to identify it, help each other identify it, and get rid of it, right? And then confronting historical and institutional practices. You'll see in that icon, it's a number of people together, arms linked, because in order for us to actually stop inequitable practices, it usually requires us to organize around it. So I'm going to stop there. Susan, do we have any questions?
And we have one question that's come in from Teresa from Kettle Moraine. And do a shout out to your great work in Kettle Moraine, Teresa, on the outcomes lever. And I just would encourage others, if you have questions, to be typing them into the chat room now in the lower left-hand corner. So Chris and Katherine, the question around outcome, the outcome lever, to what degree is this around outcomes, student outcomes, a local decision, as in graduate profile, versus a universal decision, national standard? How do we balance the desire for local control and the need for equitable expectations?
Thank you, Susan. That's a really exceptional question and a very important one. What we discuss in the paper, I'll answer this quickly and then pass it to you for any additional thoughts, Chris. There's a need for a level of consistency certainly across systems at the level of the state and the district to drive common standards for equity and common standards for student success. And so we recommend that much of this be located at a state and district level. And there is also a need for a local conversation about what that looks like in each and every district and school. So I think the best answer to your question, though maybe frustrating, is that it's a both and. There's certainly a need for state and district level consistency around graduation outcomes and other such policy decisions, as well as a very local conversation. Chris, I know this is something you think about quite often, so I'd love to let you share your thoughts as well.
Thank you. So, Teresa, that's such a hard question. It's so profound. So I think we could cut it in different ways, but my first reaction when I saw your question is everything is local in the United States except for one state, Hawaii. Other than that, the districts have so much influence about what students are expected to learn and at what level, what performance level. And of course, we have states that have some types of graduation requirements, but those usually are just in terms of courses, the number of credits, and the national standards are not enforced upon us. The national standards have been created trying to actually make it cost effective for states and districts to be able to have access to well thought out standards. The states are really the ones who embrace the standards. So what I think about in this question is a district is at risk if they don't moderate and begin to build consistency of expectation. And I think higher education could play a very critical role so that it's both districts moderating, but also including higher ed in that process so that we get those systems aligned even more tightly. But if you don't moderate, then there is a high risk that you might have lower expectations than elsewhere across the country, in which case your children graduating will be less competitive just even compared to your neighboring district. And so I think the drive towards moderation and being able to build up expectations from districts versus having anything top down needs to be thought through in terms of the risk of not doing it. I hope that makes some sense.
Thanks, Chris. That's the only question we have for now, and we'll have more time for question and answers at the end of the webinar also. Thanks.
Great. Then Katherine is going to take us away into logic models.
Yes, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Chris. I'm going to move us into, in some ways, the bulk, the meat of the paper here, which is what is our theory of what makes a comprehensive competency-based school, and presenting 4 logic models. Now, the logic models were created to really show what competency-based education can look like in practice. To take all of this content and discussion about distinguishing features and learning sciences and equity and culture and really boil them down to something that is very granular at different levels of practice. That said, it is very robust and very detailed, and so we want to pull up a level for a second here and help you think about how you might use these logic models in your own work. The first way to think about this is as a tool for self-reflection, right? So consider using the tools to identify where your school or where your system is on the path to becoming competency-based. Where are you strong? Where are you weak? Where have you not even started? Secondly, these tools can be really used for engagement to facilitate dialogue with students, teachers, families about where you are, where you want to go, and where to start. Thirdly, they can be very helpful as design tools. So you will need to begin to build your own theory of change, your own sort of roadmap for how your school or system will design for competency-based education, and the long-term plan to get there. And this can be a tool to begin to develop that strategy. And then finally, this is really about bridging research and practice. And part of that is continuously evolving our knowledge about what works. So the logic model can be used to help you study what is happening in your school or in your system, and to help you think about continually evolving your theory of change and your implementation efforts. Now, each of the logic models is pretty detailed, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the overall design of the logic models, how we organized them the way they did, and then dive into each. When we designed the logic models, the first thing we thought about was seeing the whole. So you'll notice that graphically we always depict each individual logic model, each level of practice, in the context of the other 3, as well as in the context of culture. And this is because we want to emphasize that these are interrelated and reciprocal levels of practice, right? There's no getting to quality in competency-based education by just focusing on one piece of the puzzle. You'll also notice that we integrated culture into every single logic model, and we made it its own logic model. And this is because we want to really name how culture shows up in the student experience, in professional practice, in district culture. And we also wanted to emphasize that culture is something you design for, just in the same way that you design for teaching practice or systems. And then finally, you'll notice continuous improvement called out in each logic model. So you'll see the circular arrow around the elements of the model. And you'll also notice that we move from design to assessment, to note that assessment continually informs the design and redesign of practice. As I describe each of the 4 logic models, I will share a couple of framing thoughts, as Chris did when she presented about learning sciences and equity. I won't read all of the elements. There are way too many to discuss, but I will focus on a few that are particularly important, or in some cases challenging. It may be helpful to have the paper in front of you if you've got it printed off, so you can follow the specific elements that I referenced by number. And then I'll end each logic model by sharing just 1 or 2 critical reflection questions for each. And again, there'll be time for Q&A at the end, so please, if you don't understand something or have probing questions, share them in the Q&A box. I'm going to begin with the logic model on the student experience, and it's important that this is the first one. Right? Student experience is always at the center, and it always informs all the other aspects of design. I also want to note that this is really the logic model where you see the most direct influence of the learning sciences. This is where everything that Chris shared shows up the most directly, and it's a really strong example of the research to practice bridge. And the final thing I'll share from a framing perspective is that one of the challenges in developing a technical paper like this one is that you can really sort of lose sight of the human experience, right, of education. And this is particularly challenging in this logic model where we're talking about how students experience learning and competency-based ed. And so if you reference the paper on page 33, you can see some examples just to illustrate this from a much more human-centered perspective, which may be helpful in bringing them to life. Now, for the elements that I want to focus on, I want to start with number 3, which is in the culture realm, and it's about designing for equity and inclusion. And so it's essential to the student experience to think about cultural relevancy, right? This is critical at the student level of practice. really thinking about the meaningful connections between learning and the real world, both in a student's current state, their current experience of life, and also in their future. I would also draw your attention to number 13, which is about student agency. One of the things that really distinguishes competency-based education is its emphasis on student empowerment, and the fact that this emphasis on student empowerment shows up in the learning experience, so that students are developing the skills and the dispositions to become lifelong learners who can self-direct and own their own progress. The next element I would reference in this logic model is number 21, on continuous reflection, and that's closely related to student agency in many ways. Students in competency-based education systems receive regular, consistent feedback. They know where they are in their learning, and they have the freedom and the support to drive improvements in their learning. So this continuous process of reflection on learning, the metacognitive processes, are really, really important to the student experience. And finally, I'll emphasize here number 23, advancement based on mastery. So this is critical to competency-based education, right? It's sometimes that we think about as like the most distinguishing feature of competency-based ed, that kids move forward when they've demonstrated that they've learned what's needed to be learned. This is really essential, and it's really, really hard. And so there are multiple valuable resources out there from iNACOL and others about the implications and challenges with monitoring progress and pace. I would encourage you, as you dig into this paper, to really focus here. So a couple of reflection questions to end on for this logic model before we move forward. One, it's really interesting and important to think about how students currently describe their learning experience today. And often you got to go ask them, right? How do kids actually experience learning in your classrooms? And then how do you want them to, right? What is the vision for what you want your student experience to look like? And really looking at the gaps that you may find between them. And the second question that I think is important as you bring this into your work is really asking, where do or where do not the learning sciences show up in the student experience? Where can you see evidence of learning environments and experiences that reflect what we know about the brain? I'll move next to the logic model on professional practice. And I want to share two framing thoughts here that are important. One is that in competency-based ed, the adult experience must mirror the student experience. Teachers have to experience the same types of learning and support that they are then expected to facilitate for students. So you should see some parallels here between the teacher and the student experience. And the second is that this model really acknowledges and respects, but also relies on the vital role that teachers play as designers. So in competency-based systems, teachers don't deliver curriculum. They design, facilitate, and continuously adapt learning environments and student experiences. And in many cases, this will ask systems to think about changing the role of the teacher and changing expectations, and those are important shifts to anticipate. I'm going to again look at a couple of critical elements from all those that we've listed in the full report. Number 4 in the culture box, we talk about having flexible and distributed practice. So as I referenced, right, we respect and value teachers as the consummate professionals. And so it's critical that they be empowered and they have the freedom and the autonomy to make decisions on behalf of their students in their classroom. Next, I would draw your attention to 2. I'll pair these together, numbers 10 and number 12. This is design for mastery and assessment fluency. And I highlight these 2 in the realm of professional practice because they are 2 of the most critical competencies for teaching in a competency-based context. And they may well be 2 that are the most different from traditional teaching roles, right? It is different from what we often expect teachers to do in a classroom. And so as you think about sort of where you are in this work, at a school level or at a district level, one of the critical questions really is, how are we going to help our teachers develop the ability to design learning for mastery and to use assessment in very different ways to achieve mastery? The last elements that I'll touch on in this logic model, and again I'll couple 2 of them, are numbers 17 and 21. And these are embedded professional learning and responsive inquiry practice. And so I've grouped these 2 together to highlight because they're very related, and they have to do both with how teachers grow and develop, and how teachers' growth and development is tied to student growth and development. So we'll see traditional professional development in competency-based systems, right? There are trainings, there are learning opportunities. The most valuable professional learning will be deeply embedded in the practice of teaching. In some ways, that's an individual act, right? Teachers' own reflection, coaching, and feedback. In many ways, it's a collaborative process. And so what we see in the best competency-based systems are that there are collaborative inquiry opportunities where teachers study student learning, they study student data. And it's this process of responding to student learning and student experience that informs changes at the classroom level and shifts in teachers' own practice. So those two link together in a really critical and important way. Those are the only elements that I'll discuss here just for the sake of time. Of course, there are many more. And again, I'll leave you with some questions to think about as you imagine bringing these models into your own work. The first is, to what extent do you see alignment between how teachers experience their roles as professionals and the student experience you're asking them to create? This can be tough, but it's really essential to creating coherence in your system. So really interrogating that alignment is important. Secondly, how much flexibility and autonomy do teachers have? Do they have the ability to do the kind of student responsive work that you're asking of them? And third, what are the biggest gaps between the competencies that you currently emphasize for teachers and the ones that they will need to make the shift toward becoming competency-based in their own practice? I'll move now to the third of the logic models, which is focused on district and school systems. You know, Chris made a very important point that this is definitely a structural and systemic shift, right? Competency-based ed is not piecemeal, it's not classroom by classroom. So oftentimes we think about district and school systems as kind of where we begin the transition to competency-based ed. And yes, they are essential to quality. Here's how I would encourage you to think about this level of practice. District and school systems create the conditions for school and classroom level practice, right? They are designed to make it easier, simpler, and more rational for practitioners to transition to competency-based ed than to sustain the status quo. So I'd like to use that frame as we talk about a couple of the specific elements. I'm going to begin with number one, right, which is about a vision for success tied to all students being successful. We've talked about this a number of times even in the course of this webinar, but it's because the work really starts here, right, with having a common vision for success that emphasizes all students achieving at high levels. And so as you think about this work in your own context, that's got to be a starting point. I'd emphasize number four. And so we've talked before about flexibility in teaching practice. It's also important to think about flexibility in distributed leadership across the system. And so where across the school or where across the district do you want there to be tightness, and where do you want there to be looseness? And how will you promote intentional variation between classrooms and schools? The next that I'll emphasize is number 9, which is meeting students where they are. So again, when we talked about the student experience, we talked about mastery-based progression, right, as a pedagogical principle. It's really essential to note that it's also a structural principle, right? In order for students to advance based on mastery, you have to have systems and structures in place. And so the question to think about is, what systems and what structures will you put in place or do you have in place to ensure that teachers can meet students where they are, that they can monitor progress and pace? There's a fantastic paper called Meeting Students Where They Are by Anna Cole that I would strongly encourage you to look at if you want to think more deeply about this question. And the final principles or elements rather that I'll talk about in this logic model are numbers 23 and 26, which I'll look at together. And these are about both continuous improvement and innovation. So we've identified the importance of continuously adapting practice based on student data, right? And this happens at the student level, at the classroom level, at the school level. From a systems and structure standpoint, you've really got to make sure that you have systems in place so that there can be learning at all levels of practice, right? This is a very structural shift in many ways. It's about data systems and other systems of responsive practice. And We know that this work is going to continuously evolve, right? It's not just about implementing with quality, it's about continuously seeking out and testing promising new ideas and practices. And so thinking about where and how you have flexibility and resources in your school or system to do that kind of innovative work with intentionality. The reflection question I will leave you with here is whether, if you look at the cultural and the structural conditions in your school and in your district or state, really reflect on, do they make it easier for a teacher to perform as required in a competency-based system versus the status quo? In other words, are your district and school systems and structures incentivizing and supporting the kinds of behaviors that you want to see? And that conversation, that question, can yield some really valuable dialogue. All right, we're getting to the end here, so I'm going to move to our final logic model, which is the logic model on culture. And again, I want to iterate that we've chosen to present culture as part of the previous 3 logic models to emphasize how critical it is at all levels of practice. And we've also chosen to develop it as its own to really help you as practitioners think about design and implementation strategies for culture with the same level of intentionality and granularity that you would think about strategies for curriculum, for instruction, professional learning, and other types of practice. Here again, I'll emphasize just a few elements that are important. What I'll begin with is number 4, which is about addressing bias and beliefs. So the question is, how are you creating systems of support and systems of accountability to help teachers and leaders and even students identify and root out implicit bias, right? Chris mentioned this in the conversation about culture, and it's something you've got to design for, right? You've got to design the right supports and the right systems and structures. And thinking about this as an individual attribute, but also as systemic or an organizational property, right? How are you thinking about systemic bias across your school or district? We think a lot in this logic model about growth mindset, which is critical to implementation. People need to be able to think about continuous improvement and be able to accept, right, the reality and inevitability of failure in the process of change. This is important for students in their learning, for teachers in their teaching, for leaders in their leading, all of the above. And so we encourage you to think about this as an individual trait, right? How are you going to help teachers and students embrace growth? And also as an organizational trait or a systemic property, right? How do you create systems that allow for and embrace smart failure as a part of learning and improvement? In this logic model, we also talk about relationships, right? How at the end of the day, none of this works if teachers do not deeply know their students. And so as you think about designing for culture, right, what are you putting in place to make sure that teachers know how to relate to their students? Do they have the time to build relationships and the support? And what are you doing to put in place systems, strong systems that can track student development over time, help a teacher really know who a student is and where they've been in their learning trajectory. And then finally, we emphasize, as number 17 in the full logic model, we call reciprocal accountability. And to take the sort of jargon out of this, I would just say competency-based ed cannot work in a gotcha culture. Right? It is vital that accountability is shared, that everyone is responsible for student success. And that for every sort of dose of accountability, right, everything you ask of and expect of a teacher or student or leader, there's a dose of support. And that attribute of culture is particularly important when you're asking people to take on the seismic shifts that are required by competency ed. So before I wrap up here, just a few more reflection questions. How does your espoused culture, right, what you say the culture is, relate to or differ from the lived culture, how people actually experience it? And how do you know, right? How do you know the differences? And how will you bridge those gaps? And then when you think about sort of where you are and where you want to go, what are the biggest shifts and how are you going to begin to make them? So I'm going to close here, having just shared a lot of content, and move us forward into the Q&A section. So Susan, are there any questions that we have from participants that we want to try to answer in our meeting?
Great comments in the chat room. There's one specific question that comes from Laura Shields, and it was back when you were talking about culture, continuous improvement, and accountability. And she's asking, what are some examples of effective incentive systems you could have in place. Have you seen any examples of effective incentive systems that draw into this notion of culture in a competency-based ed system?
Chris, I wonder if you want to take this one, if you can draw on some examples you've seen in your touring around the country.
Sure. You know, it's interesting. It's such an interesting question because I'm going to actually take a step back from it and say I think the sense of meaning, I clarified with Laura that she was talking about incentives for teachers, and the sense of purpose and meaning tends to be the predominant thing I hear from those teachers who have really said, I'm going to make this work, right? And what they'll say repeatedly is the first year, I've never worked so hard, I've never learned so much, but this is why I came into teaching. This is what I thought it was all about. And the sense of purpose and going home at the end of the day is so meaningful for them. And I think that in and of itself is an incentive and something that can be monitored and tracked, right? So if people are going home feeling they're just going through the motions or they're doing things because of some other reason other than the kids, if you can track that, the incentive structure really is staying focused on what's best for kids. Two other things we'll see is that districts that fully embrace personalized learning, we're not talking about technology, we're talking about it in terms of agency, interests, and differentiated instruction all packaged together. Personalized learning and competency-based education, then take that to how they help the adults in the system. And that creates an incentive in the sense of I get to work on what I think is important to me and in my ability to help my students. So I'm not going to professional development because I have to, because it's Tuesday and we're all going to sit in the same class because someone decided that was important. It's much more based on my own personalized plan. And that seems to also be very, very motivating. And then the third is, and this is part of the culture, there's a lot of different ways that schools and districts can celebrate learning. And I've been in classrooms, right, where the teachers will actually ring a bell when a student's met their next learning target, and everybody kind of shouts, yay, and they keep going. But you can also celebrate that in terms of your teachers and really recognizing and rewarding them for learning. And I think there's already been a little bit of work, but I think we'll see more work done around rethinking evaluation, because teacher evaluation is by nature, there's a judgment in it. And so some people think we need to separate out the personalized learning plans from the evaluations, and there's others that say, no, 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 let's just have a system designed around learning. And if you meet your learning goals, then we're going to reward you for that. So I know that we have Teresa Wall from Kettle Moraine on this webinar, and they've really looked at teacher incentive plans also around learning. So there's one more question. Susan, do you want to?
One more question from Bill, and we're at time. Bill wanted to ask, what are the most important supports for leadership advocating and guiding districts and schools through a competency-based change process? And I know, Chris, you authored a wonderful report that looks at district implementations and lessons from local leaders. We can put the link up. How would you answer Bill's question?
Bill, the leaders are so hungry across the country. Form a network. Find some other people who know more than you, and form that network of people who you can exchange ideas, who will play a critical friend, who will push you. We all have to become stronger critical friends for each other to make sure that we reach quality. And I think that's really, honestly, the most important thing you need to do. So we're at time. We've got another webinar coming up with Katherine and myself on July 18th, and we're going to dive into equity a little bit deeper in that conversation. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Katherine. Thank you, Susan. And thanks, everybody, for coming.
Yes, thank you. Thanks our authors and our presenters today, Chris Sturgis and Katherine Casey, and we'll look forward to joining again in the webinar series. Thanks, everyone. Take care.